This is Evan with EB3D Printing. In today's video, we're taking the Ender 5 Plus from this to this. That's right, we're doing a silent fan mod conversion for the Ender 5 Plus. This modification will feature a few of the typical Noctua fans that you see in most fan mods, but this will also feature one underdog fan that I don't see mentioned too often in silent fan mods. That fan is the GTS Time 24 volt 4020 brushless fan. The good news, since this is a 24 volt fan, we don't have to mess around with buck converters. That makes this sort of a quick, easy swap over. So just a little bit of snipping, stripping, and soldering, and we're good to go. But that's enough for me. Let's get into it.
As always, when working on the electronics of the printer, make sure the power is off and the power cable is unplugged. To start off, we are going to be removing the two fans on the extruder, the hot end fan and the parts cooling fan. We're going to use the 2.5mm hex key to remove the bolts that hold the hot end fan on. After that, we'll take the 2mm hex key and remove the bolt that holds the part cooling fan to the extruder frame. Then we are going to take the 2.5mm hex key again and loosen the two bolts that hold the hot end to the carriage. You just need to loosen them, you don't need to take them the whole way off. Next up, we're going to be removing any cable management that may be on the hot end cabling. I prefer these cable management straps versus zip ties because it makes for easy reuse. You can just take them off, slide them around, move them wherever you need to. I remove the cable strain relief that I have on the hot end. Next, you're going to push back this cabling sock, I call it, and that exposes the hot end cabling. From my previous video where I installed the DDX extruder, I've already installed these JST connectors. So I'm just going to unplug them quick. As we look at the cabling, I used two different color shrink wraps to differentiate between the hot end cable and the parts cooling cable. Yellow is for the hot end, black is for parts cooling. For the hot end fan, it's really easy. You just match up the red cable to the red cable and the black cable to the black cable. For parts cooling, however, though, it's a bit different. For parts cooling, red matches to yellow, which is the 24 volt power, and black matches to blue, which is the ground. Next up, we're just going to remove the two fans from the extruder. First up, I'm taking off the parts cooling fan, and we can just set that to the side. And then last up, I'm removing the hot end fan. And here is a shot of the hot end fan. The first fan mod we are going to be doing is the parts cooling fan. Here's a shot of the parts cooling fan that I'm using. I will provide a link to this in the description. One note involving the JST connectors is that you may have to flip the cabling of the fans. As you can see here, if I were to plug this in and try to use it, the wires do not match. Black goes to red and red goes to black, which is backwards. So to fix this, what I do is I take a small flathead screwdriver and lightly press on the teeth holding the wires into the JST connector. You do not want to press too hard as it will smash the teeth down too far and you won't be able to pry them back up. Here's a closer look at the wire connectors of the JST. As you can see, the teeth on the top of these wire connectors, these are what you need to pry back up. I use a very sharp pair of tweezers to pry these up. You do not want to pull too hard on them because you could actually break these teeth off. So just be careful when you pry them up, and you don't need to pry them up too far either. You just need a little height on them so they catch on the inside of the JST connector. After we have them pried up, we just slide the JST connector back on, making sure that when facing the back of the connector, the red wire is on the left and the black wire is on the right. After you insert them, just pull them a little bit to make sure they are securely in place. As you can see, when we connect the wire back up, red matches to red and black matches to black. Now that we have made sure that the wires are connected properly, we can go to installing the parts cooling fan. First up, take the 2mm hex key to attach the bolt that holds the parts cooling fan on. And you want to slide this up, make sure it's in the appropriate position, and then tighten it down. Once it is tightened down, we just connect the parts cooling fan wires together, and that is it for the parts cooling fan installation. The next mod we are doing is the hot end fan. Here's a shot of the hot end fan, and again, a link will be in the description. I went ahead and swapped the wires already, making sure that the red and black match up properly. After the wires are in place, take the 2.5mm hex key and tighten the 2 bolts holding the hot end to the carriage. Since we are using a 20mm deep fan, we're going to need longer bolts. Here's a set of bolts I am using. Again, a link will be in the description. I used 3 20mm bolts to hold the hot end fan on. Use the 2.5mm hex key to place 3 bolts into the hot end, making sure they are tightened down. And the last step to installing the hot end fan is to redo the cable management, putting the wire straps and cable strain relief back into place. In order to work on the component case fans, we need to remove the component case from the printer. To do this, we take the 4mm hex key and loosen the 4 bolts holding the case to the printer frame. After the 4 bolts are out, we will move on to disconnecting all of the wiring. We will start with the wires leading into the case, and then move on to disconnecting the stepper motor and end stop wires. After all of the wires are disconnected and clear, we will then pull out the component case and set that to the side before we start working on it. The first case fan we're going to replace is the motherboard fan. It uses the same fan we used on the hot end. To start off, we take the 2mm hex key and remove the 6 bolts that hold the bottom plate onto the case. After these 6 bolts are out, you'll want to be careful removing the bottom plate as the motherboard fan wires are connected. If your motherboard is still stock, there will be hot glue holding the connector onto the motherboard. Then we take the 2mm hex key and remove the 4 bolts holding the fan to the bottom plate. After that is off, we place the new motherboard fan onto the post. Here is the bolt set I used for the motherboard fan. I used 4 M3x20 bolts for this. Again, use the 2mm hex key to place in these bolts. After you have the 4 bolts attached, you can set the bottom plate aside until we're ready to put the case back together. Now we move on to the power supply fan, but first we have to disassemble the power supply. I would suggest taking a picture of the wire positions of the PSU, that way when we go to reconnect the wires later, that you know where to connect the wires in the correct position. Before loosening the screws that hold the wires, you may need to pop off these plastic protective covers. After the wires are disconnected, we'll use a 2.5mm hex key to remove the 4 bolts that hold the PSU bracket to the component case. After the 4 bolts are loose, we'll then just pull the power supply out of the case and set the case to the side. After the power supply is out of the case, we'll use the 2.5mm hex key again to loosen the 4 bolts that hold the brackets to the power supply, and then remove the brackets and set them to the side. With the brackets removed, we then take a Phillips head screwdriver and remove the 6 bolts that hold the PSU top panel to the PSU case. After the bolts are out, we'll gently remove the top panel of the PSU. Here's one thing you'll have to watch for. The fan cable may be held in place underneath some glue. Unfortunately, I didn't have a way to remove the glue without the possibility of damaging the PSU, so I decided the safest decision was to just cut the cable on either side of the glue. Be sure to unplug the fan cable before cutting the wire, then snip the wire on the connector side of the glue. Next up, take the Phillips head screwdriver again and remove the 2 bolts that hold the PSU fan to the case. After those bolts are out, then we'll snip the fan side of the cable as close to the glue as we can. Here is a quick shot of the PSU fan. The last fan we are going to modify is the PSU fan. Here's a quick shot of the PSU fan I used. A link to it will be in the description. It's a Noctua 12 volt 15mm thick fan. We can't use a thicker fan as it won't fit in the component case. Here are the JST connectors I used. Let me flip them over so you can, now you can see it. We use 1 male connector for the PSU fan for this, so that's all you'll need. We'll start by snipping off the 4-pin connector that's on the PSU fan. There are 4 wires for this fan. It's a 4-pin fan. We'll only need 2 of them to connect the JST connector to. The 2 wires that we are worried about are the yellow wire, which is the 12 volt wire, and the black wire, which is the ground. The green wire is for RPM reporting, and the blue wire is for the PWM control. We will match up the black wire of the JST connector to the black wire of the fan, and the red wire of the JST connector to the yellow wire of the fan. Here's a quick shot of the replacement top panel for the PSU case. This is on Thingiverse, but I will provide a link below. We'll start by measuring the wires on the fan to get the correct length of wire, and then we'll match up the JST connector wire to the fan wire so we have the correct point where we need to cut both wires. After we have the correct measurement, we'll go ahead and snip both sets of wires, and then we'll start by stripping the JST connector wires. You only need about 3/8 of an inch exposed. And then we'll strip the yellow and black wire on the fan. Again, only about 3/8 of an inch needs to be exposed. Here's a quick look at the shrink wrap tubes that I used. I used one piece of shrink wrap and I just cut it in half. Make sure you put the shrink wrap on before you solder the wires together. We've all made that mistake before. After the shrink wrap is on, we'll match up the yellow wire to the red wire and then twist them together. After they're twisted together, since I don't have a pair of helping hands, I just used a pair of pliers to hold the JST connector, and then I went ahead and soldered the yellow and red wire together. I'm not the best electrician, so my soldering skills may be below par, but after the wires are soldered together, slide over the shrink wrap tubing, and then I just use the iron to shrink the shrink wrap. And then we repeat this process for the black wires, which are the ground. Twist them together, put them in the pair of pliers, and then solder them. Again, after soldered, slide over the shrink wrap tubing and use the iron again to shrink it. Now, I went ahead and used the heat shielding that was on the original fan wires. What I did is I took the JST connector off using the screwdriver method from earlier. And once the connector is off, I just slide over the heat shielding to get a quick measurement of where the end of the wires are. And then I cut the heat shielding to the appropriate length. And then slide on a piece of shrink wrap over the heat shielding, and then slide the heat shielding back onto the set of wires. And then use the iron again to shrink the shrink wrap onto the wires. I used a pair of tweezers to pull up the teeth on the JST connector wires. That way it bites when you put the connector back on. Pull the connector, make sure it is snug. Then use the 4 screws to mount the fan to the top case panel. After we're done mounting the 4 screws, we plug the wire into the PSU board. Once that wire is plugged in, we'll line up the tabs on the top panel with the screw holes. And then we'll put in the 6 screws that hold the top panel to the PSU case. After those 6 screws are in, we'll then mount the brackets that hold the PSU to the component case. We'll use the 2.5mm hex key to put in these 4 bolts that hold the brackets to the PSU. The final step is to put it all back together. First up, we will put the PSU back into the component case by using the 2.5mm hex key to attach the 4 bolts that hold the PSU brackets to the case. Once those are in, we will go ahead and reconnect the wires to the PSU. Take note that you can use the photo that I suggested taking earlier. That way you put the wires back into the correct location. And then after you have all of the wires attached, you can go ahead and slide back on the protective plastic coverings over the wires. Now I went ahead and cut a larger hole into the bottom panel. I used a 3.5-inch hole saw to cut this hole. That means I'll have to reattach the motherboard fan using the 2mm hex key on the 4 bolts. Once I have that attached, I plug in the motherboard fan into the appropriate slot on the motherboard. Next up, take the 2mm hex key to attach the 6 bolts that hold the bottom panel onto the case. After I have those 6 bolts in, it's time to put the case back into the printer. Slide the case back into the printer, making sure the wires are out of the way. And then use the 4mm hex key on the 4 bolts that hold the component case to the printer frame. After those 4 bolts are tightened down, it's then time to reattach all of the wiring, making sure to connect the right connectors together. And then once that is done, we have successfully completed the silent fan install. And this is the section you are all probably here for, the before and after comparison. This is before. And this is after.
Well, that's it for the silent fan modification on the Ender 5 Plus. I hope this guide was informative and it helps you out in the future if you decide to silent fan mod your Ender 5 Plus. I unfortunately do not have the necessary equipment to give you exact readings as far as decibels go of the before and after. I just have the raw sound coming from the camera, which I hope is enough to help you discern the difference between the before and after. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. If you like this content and would like to see more, well, you know what to do. If you would like to support this channel, I have a link to do so in the description. As always, I would like to thank you all for checking this out, and I'll see you in the next one.